Afternoon. There you are. I'm Wendy McCrory, and I'm the program manager in information technology, and I'm representing the NDSU Phi Kappa Phi board. This lecture is being recorded, and for those of you attending in person and on Zoom, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. So a little history, NDSU and the NDSU chapter of Phi Kappa Phi have been proudly partnering and offering the NDSU Phi Kappa Phi Fraternity Lectureship Award. The lectureship was created by President Brashani and NDSU's Phi Kappa Phi chapter in 2015 to showcase NDSU faculty talents that exemplify the Phi Kappa Phi mission and motto, let the love of learning rule humankind. Phi Kappa Phi is not a fraternity or a sorority, but an honor society. The NDSU chapter is 112 years old, starting in 1913. It's the nation's 10th oldest chapter out of over 300 throughout the country, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. NDSU's chapter is the only one in North Dakota to have this honor. The NDSU Phi Kappa Phi lectureship shall be awarded to those individuals whose outstanding high-impact research, scholarship, or creative activity consistently supports NDSU's top-tier research status, who have proven ability to effectively present their research to a broad community in the land-grant tradition. More specifically, all winners of the NDSU Phi Kappa Phi faculty lectureship must have a proven ability to effectively and dynamically communicate their research to an intelligent listener and be passionate about communicating what they do to others so that the latter can appreciate the beauty of the research and know its ramifications to others. Now to introduce Dr. Benton is Dr. Jess Young, Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Bradley Benton. Dr. Benton is originally from South Carolina, where his family was consistently puzzled by why he wanted to study Latin American history. As he writes, but the heart wants what the heart wants. Brad's love of Latin American history led UCLA to award him a PhD in that subject in 2012, which is the same year he started teaching at NDSU. Brad's research is focused specifically on 16th century Mexico and the ways that the Nahuas, or Aztecs of central Mexico, navigated the first 100 years of Spanish rule. He has co-edited and translated 2 book-length works by the early colonial Mexican chronicler Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxochitl, say that 3 times fast, published by Penn State Press and the University of Oklahoma Press. And his book monograph, The Lords of Texcoco, was published by Cambridge University Press. He has also published work with presses in Mexico and Peru. He is currently working on a translation of a 1539 Inquisition trial for use in the undergraduate classroom and a second monograph project about intimate partner choice among 16th century Nahuas. Dr. Benton's work has been supported by the Fulbright Commission, the National Endowment for Humanities, and the Mellon Foundation, among others. He is a contributing editor of the Library of Congress's Handbook of Latin American Studies, has been a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Ethnohistory, and a grant proposal reviewer for the National Endowment for Humanities. His wife, Neely, is the director of graduate admissions and recruitment at NDSU, and their 3 boys attend school in Moorhead. Please help me welcome Dr. Bradley Benton.
Thank you, Jess. Thanks to you all also for coming out on a cold day to listen to me drone on here. I'd also like to thank Phi Kappa Phi and also the members of the Faculty Awards and Recognition Committee for doing the work of selecting and I'm very honored that that I was the choice. I'd also like to thank the Provost Office, and specifically Ann Fredrickson and Carrie Ann Platt for doing some extra hustle for this. Finally, I want to thank my colleagues in history, Angela Smith and Tracy Barrett, who nominated me for this award. These women are exceptional colleagues, but they are also very decent human beings. And I am very lucky to work with them. Thanks. Okay, so today I want to talk about the conquest of Mexico. Has anybody heard of it? Show of hands. Anybody heard of it? Yeah. Does anybody know anything about it? Yeah, okay, yeah, a little bit. All right, well, I'm gonna give you like the brief overview, so don't worry. I'm gonna start actually with what I'm gonna call the traditional narrative of the conquest, which basically says that a Spaniard named Hernando Cortez over there on the left, and a handful of guys, Spaniards who came with him from Cuba, arrived in 1519 and launched a campaign against the Aztec Empire led at the time by Emperor Montezuma. This is the route they took from Cuba. My apologies, this map's still using the traditional name for that body of water. But anyway, they came from Cuba in 1519. And it wasn't smooth sailing always for the Spaniards. They suffered some setbacks, like in 1520. They were in the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, and they got chased out in 1520 by the Aztec. So that was like a rough patch. But by 1521, they had prevailed. And the traditional narrative gives much of the credit for this victory to the military genius of Cortez, who built ships to sail around the island city. So Tenochtitlan is in a lake. It's on an island in a lake. And they had a lot of trouble getting around. So Cortez said, I'm going to build some ships. So it worked out, right? It cut off the Aztec from supplies and reinforcements from the mainland. And so the traditional narrative says Cortez, he's so smart. He did all that. He figured it out, and he brought down the Aztec. The traditional narrative also gives a lot of credit to God, who allegedly greatly disliked the barbaric, savage, heathen practices of the Aztec, right? Things like human sacrifice. And if we just take this traditional narrative at face value, it does seem almost sort of miraculous that the Spaniards would have won. I mean, there were just a few of them. And there were hundreds of thousands of native people. One of the conquistadors wrote later, he said, "When in ancient or modern times have such huge enterprises of so few succeeded against so many?" And that is, miraculous. So few Spaniards, so many native people, and they toppled the Aztec Empire in 2 years. So this is the traditional narrative. And it's a narrative that starts to circulate almost immediately in Europe, right? Cortez himself is writing letters back to the king in Spain, but he's also sending them to presses at the same time, and gets translated really quickly. So it circulates in Spain, it circulates in German and in French and in Italian and in English really quickly. In just a few decades, pretty much everybody in Europe knows about what the Spaniards have done. And that story that everybody knows in the 16th century is a story that was written and framed by the Spaniards. Because, as my students like to tell me, history is written by the winners. And it's true, like this traditional narrative is written by the winners in this conflict. If we look at these traditional accounts written by the Spaniards come off looking pretty good, and Native people come off looking pretty bad. This particular framing of the conflict between the Spanish and the Aztec has been remarkably persistent. And it's shaped how we have come to view Native peoples, even today, right? And not just Native peoples in Mexico or in Latin America, but the Spanish accounts of the conquest of Mexico have shaped our perceptions of Native peoples all over the Western Hemisphere, including here on the Northern Plains, right? The story of Cortez, it doesn't stay confined to Latin America. It goes everywhere. So, for example, this painter in the mid-19th century, he's French, right? He is intrigued, seduced by this traditional narrative, and he's painted Cortez in the middle here, right? With sword drawn, approaching what I think is the Aztec emperor, and priests who are guarding their pre-Hispanic religion, right? And it's a pre-Hispanic religion made of snakes, apparently. And everyone else here, these are all supposed to be Native people around Cortez. It's a very romantic view, but it's a view, right, that has persisted until 1850, right? And it doesn't just persist in France. Lots of people in the United States also sort of are seduced by this narrative, particularly in the 19th century, because we see ourselves in Cortez, right? We are expanding to the West in the 19th century, and we see a lot of parallels in that history. So we identify with him, and it becomes a very popular story in the US. In the last several decades, though, scholars have started to sort of question the narrative that we received from the Spaniards about what happened in Tenochtitlan in 1521. And today I want to talk about how that narrative has changed and about my own role in helping to change that narrative. The earliest English language accounts pretty much just parrot what the Spaniards have to say about the conquest of Mexico, namely that civilized and Christian heroes prevailed against barbaric, savage, pagan villains, right? In 1843, this guy, William Hickling Prescott, brings the conquest of Mexico to the US reading public with his 3-volume History of the Conquest of Mexico, 1843. And this is very popular reading, right? He's already established himself as a historian. People are already buying his books. And when this comes out, they eat it up. And it's the same, pretty much the same story that Cortez told, right? This sort of heroic, triumphalist narrative building on that tradition of Spanish chroniclers, like Cortez's own account. So the traditional narrative that the Spaniards told about what they had done is the same narrative that the US public first hears and absorbs. And it's that same history written by the winners. By the middle of the 20th century, though, scholars, particularly in Mexico, are increasingly interested in what they're calling the victims of conquest, right? And this begins in earnest in 1959 with the publication of Visión de los Vencidos, Vision of the Vanquished, by Miguel León Portilla, who's a very well-known Mexican historian. León Portilla is part of a larger movement, really, all over the Americas and in Europe that is reconsidering history, particularly the history of marginalized groups, right? Native people, Black people, but also women, right? The mid-20th century. And León Portilla realizes that for the conquest of Mexico, right, there are other sources besides the ones that the Spanish chroniclers left behind, right? We have native sources produced by native peoples themselves. On the left over there is the Florentine Codex, which has some lovely painted depictions of the conquest painted by native people. And the column of text is actually written in the native language Nahuatl, right? So the history of the conquest of Mexico as told in a native language by native people. And then over here is the Tierra de Tepechpan, which is also written by native people in a less Europeanized style. This is using a lot of the same conventions they would have used in the pre-contact period, but it nonetheless tells the story of the Spanish arrival. So Leon Portilla, by looking away from the Spanish sources and looking towards these native sources, comes up with a totally different narrative, right? And he ignites a sort of revolution in the way that historians understand the conquest of Mexico. And it turns out that if we look at sources produced by native peoples tend to look a lot more human than if you're only consulting sources produced by Spaniards. So it's harder and harder for people by the middle of the 20th century, for historians, to think of native peoples as villains in the narrative of the conquest. Spaniards also start to look a little less heroic and a little less brilliant. It becomes clear that there are other factors that contributed to the fall of the Aztec Empire, like the weapons that the Spaniards brought with them, and also the diseases that Spaniards unwittingly brought with them. So this is a very important shift in the way that historians are thinking about the events of 1521. The dramatic defeat of native people is more complicated, right? It can't really be explained by saying, oh, the Spaniards are just super smart, or Spaniards are super heroic, or God loves Spaniards. You know, like, I'm sure he does. But around the turn of the 21st century, scholars have taken their skepticism even further. And they start to question whether or not there actually was a dramatic defeat for native people. Were they even defeated? This starts, arguably, with James Lockhart in the 90s, who starts reading native language documents that are produced after the conquest, produced in the colonial period. And he concludes that there's actually a lot of stuff, a lot about native culture and even native politics that had not changed dramatically. He sees a lot of continuity in the way that native people are using land, for example, from the pre-contact to the post-contact period. A lot of continuity in family organization, even political systems. He sees a lot of continuity. And this suggests to him that the conquest wasn't as radical a break as the Spaniards like Cortez had wanted us to believe. A couple of years later, this book comes out, edited by Laura Matthew and Michelle Audyke. And it's an edited volume. They've got lots of scholars in this volume. And these scholars are also noticing something that seems to undermine Cortez's traditional narrative, and even Leon Portilla's narrative about victims. And what they are noticing is the Spaniards don't act alone. That in fact, they pick up a lot of native allies along the way to the battlefield. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of native allies who join sides with the Spaniards. And this is pretty revolutionary too, to point this out and call historians to focus on it. We can no longer really talk about the conquest in terms of Spaniards versus native people, because native people are fighting on both sides. Some historians tried really hard for a while to get us to call the conquest a civil war. I didn't really catch on. But it has become more common for historians to stop using the word conquest and be more precise about the events. Most of us are calling it the Spanish-Aztec War or something like that these days. Anyway, we've had to reevaluate how we think about what happened in 1521. And my work, I think, has contributed, like in modest ways, all right, to this reevaluation of the conquest. And that's what I want to talk about for the remainder of our time. some examples of things that I've studied to help complicate the ways that we think about native peoples under colonial control. Because native peoples are neither villains nor victims. At least they weren't exclusively victims, right? In a lot of ways, they acted like any other human would have acted in their situation, which is in their own interest. Okay, so the Aztec in Tenochtitlan are actually just one group of a much larger group of people known as the Nahuas. And there's the little lake, or there's the little island in the big lake where they live. There's Tenochtitlan, home of the Aztec. They're actually properly called the Mexica. And they're just one Nahua group. There are actually hundreds of Nahua communities in central Mexico. They organize themselves into city-states that they called Altepet. And my research focused on just one of these Altepet, one of these city-states in particular, and that is the Altepet of Texcoco. I like to spell it with a TZ. And the Texcocans were just to the east of Mexico City on the edge of the lake. And they were actually a really close ally of Tenochtitlan, a really close ally. They were a member of what we call the Triple Alliance that formed, that is the Aztec Empire. They were a founding member of the Aztec Empire. But one very interesting thing about Texcocan history is that they defected from the Aztec Empire about halfway through the war against the Spaniards. And they turned their backs on their old ally, Tenochtitlan, and they joined the Spaniards. And they're pretty proud of this, especially since it turns out that they chose the winners. One of the descendants of the conquest-era rulers of Texcoco wrote extensively about all of the help that his ancestors had given the Spaniards. And this is Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxochitl. He wrote what is known as the 13th account, and it's in Spanish, and it comes from around 1605. And 2015, I co-edited and translated this account, published it in English. And if there was a thesis to this account written by Alva Ixtlilxochitl, it would be that his ancestors were super tight with the Spaniards and gave them tons of help in their war against the Aztec Empire. And he's really specific about the kind of help that his ancestors gave. They provided fighters, soldiers, fighting men, but they also provided military officers. And they also provided food. And they also provided strategic advice and military intelligence. He writes that his ancestors were, quote, the greatest and most loyal allies that Cortez had in this land, and whose aid in winning this land was second only to God's, which is a pretty strong assertion. So this Texcocan account of the conquest really complicates the traditional narrative promoted by Spaniards. It's really hard to think of this conflict as a native versus Spaniard conflict. And it also presents the native people as really smart, as tactically smart, as strategically smart collaborators. And it presents the Spaniards as dependent, like almost entirely dependent on the Texcocans and other native peoples for basic stuff like food, supplies, fighters. So Alva Ixtlilxochitl's account moves us well beyond the natives as villains trope, but it also moves us well beyond that natives as victims trope too, right? Alva Ixtlilxochitl presents his ancestors as anything but victims. In his work, they're smart, they're strong, they are the masters of their own destiny, not the Spaniards. And why would the Texcocans have done this? Why would they have turned on their own people and joined the Spaniards? I say it's because it's in their interests. They're tired of Montezuma, maybe, meddling in Texcocan politics. Maybe they're tired of playing second fiddle to the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan. Maybe they could just see which side was going to win. They were like, peace out. And also, the Mexica at Tenochtitlan aren't their own people. That's not their people. Their people live in Texcoco, right? There's no like pan-indigenous sort of identity or loyalty that they are, turning their backs on. Native history is really messy business. It's not straightforward. There's very little black and white. There's very little that is all good or all bad. Native history resists easy categories or easy narratives that fit nicely with what we want, with our current understandings or our current wishes. Sorry. Some of my other work has examined Texcoco after the conquest episodes, what we would call the colonial period, the early colonial period, the first 100 years or so after the conquest, from the 1520s to the 1620s. And what I found is, again, a messy history that refuses to fit neatly into categories of good and bad. What I found are examples of Native people in Texcoco making choices that suited their interests. And here are a couple of examples. The first one is a guy named Don Carlos. He comes into the historical record in the 1530s. He's the brother of the ruler of Texcoco, the native ruler of Texcoco. And we know about him because he gets picked up by the Inquisition. And he gets interrogated. And he gets burned at the stake in 1539 for heresy and for trying to spread heresy among the Nahuas in Texcoco. Specifically, he wants the Nahuas to throw off Catholicism, throw off Spanish rule, and return to their old ways. His story has fascinated scholars for at least the last 100 years. Most of them have viewed him as a victim of Spanish colonialism. And that makes sense because he is killed for rejecting Spanish political and religious authority. And in my work, I am not trying to say that he's not a victim, but I do find a lot of stuff that complicates his story quite a bit. So my book that came out in 2018 is essentially an extended study of Don Carlos's family, right? The rulers and the noble class of Texcoco. And the way that his family behaves towards him during the Inquisition trial is really, really incredible. They do not come to his aid. So why not? Well, I mean, they're probably a little bit scared to stick their necks out. But it also appears from this trial record that they really, really, really don't like him. Especially the women in his family. These women, he has a sister, a sister-in-law, and his wife, who all testify against him. And they provide some of the most damning testimony when they get questioned by the Inquisition. They all note with disgust that he has taken his niece as his mistress and had 2 children with her. They also all tell a pretty crazy story about how he tried to break into his sister-in-law's house one night to try to have sex with her. And they all also suggest that Don Carlos is somehow trying to seize political control by force, to usurp it, right? To take it away from the people that should have it. He has a lot of brothers who also provide testimony in this case, and they don't throw him under the bus in the same ways that his female relatives do, but they also don't really defend him either. So in this situation, this example, it's hard for me to see his execution as a Spaniards versus Native people event, right? Because his relatives are clearly helping out the Inquisition. So why is there no solidarity among the members of the ruling family in Texcoco? Why don't they come to his aid? And it's because families have drama. Even native families, even colonized families have drama. Because Native people, it turns out, are human, just like the rest of us. All right, one more example, and then I'm going to be done. It's Don Carlos's brother. His name is Tlahuitotzin, or Don Antonio. And he gets put in charge of Texcoco sort of right after Don Carlos is killed by the Inquisition. So he's the ruler, and he's got a pretty tough job. He's got to try not to get burned at the stake like his brother just had. And he also has to try to keep his family from trying to get him burned at the stake. Tough job, you know, you gotta walk that line. It's a balancing act, you know, no room for error. But Don Antonio performs this balancing act beautifully, perfectly, expertly. He is super focused both on things that native rulers are supposed to be focused on traditionally, like making repairs to the aqueduct that brings water to the community. This is something that's his job. It's his job. It always has been the job of the ruler, right? To make sure people can drink water. He also is in charge of collecting tribute, like just how he had his family had for the last couple hundred years. But he is also focused on the things that the Spaniards are interested in, right? And he talks about this quite a bit in some documents that he leaves behind. He's really focused on building Catholic churches in the neighborhoods of Texcoco. He also gets baptized. He has a very powerful baptismal sponsor who is a count in Spain, and the count allows him to use his coat of arms, right? So he seeks out a very Spanish symbol of power, a coat of arms. And he also is collecting tribute from the native people in Texcoco. It's a traditional task, but now he's giving some of that tribute over to Spaniards. So Don Antonio is straddling two worlds, serving two masters, right? And it's kind of amazing, in my opinion, that he does it like so well. He is the master of his own destiny, making decisions that he hopes are going to secure for him a position in this very new colonial order. So I think that all of these examples from my work show that Native people are not villains and that they are only partially victims. In a lot of ways, Native peoples themselves are building the colonial world. They're literally building it by like constructing churches, right, which cannot be built without native laborers and craftspeople. But they're also figuratively building the new colonial order by asserting themselves, right, by fighting on the same side as Cortez in the war against the Aztec Empire, by allowing, perhaps even encouraging, the Inquisition to execute your problematic brother, by continuing to collect tribute in the traditional way, and then turning around and handing some of it over to Spanish authorities. So why would Native people do these things? Why do they willingly participate in building a colonial system that oppresses Native people? And the answer is because history is complicated. Because some Native people are trying to benefit from the colonial system, because Native peoples make decisions that they think are in their best interests, and because Native peoples are humans, just like the rest of us. They are not pure, but they're also not evil, right? They're not villains. And they're not only victims, they're just humans. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions?
Thanks, Brad. That was really interesting. So I have a kind of weird specific question. So if it's too specific, you can just tell me and we'll talk about it later. But I wanted to go back to one of the first things you talked about, which was when they got kicked out in 1520, which is the Night of Sorrows. Is that right?
Sad night.
Yeah, the sad night. Okay.
According to the Spaniards, it's sad.
And so that wasn't so good for them. And so I'm wondering across these accounts, as you go from like Cortez's account all the way through to kind of modern accounts, how interpretation of that, if that has changed and how that's kind of been viewed, or I don't know, maybe it's too specific.
So like the native accounts that describe that event.
Yeah, versus maybe how
They
Cortez described it.
Yeah, native accounts emphasize how foolish the Spaniards were as they retreated, because they had to go across this lake, right? And the causeways that connected to the mainland were, they had big gaps in them, and so the Spaniards were having to jump over them or like swim through them. But the Spaniards refused to leave behind the gold that they had stolen from the Aztec treasury. And so a lot of them like were drowned because they wouldn't let go of their treasure. So, I mean, yeah, the native perspective is a little different, right? For the Spaniards, it's very sad. For the native people, it's just pathetic, I guess, you know?
So when European countries conquer lands overseas, those conquests become part of a collective memory and sort of the grandeur that builds over time, like hundreds of years, and becomes embedded in that nation's being. This re-evaluation of the sources, how has that been received in Spain, not just by historians, but by Spanish people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So first I want to talk about Mexico, because there are a lot of white people in Mexico. And you might expect that this could be problematic, this could be challenging, right, for the establishment in Mexico to accept. But generally, 20th century Mexico is like pretty okay with this stuff, because they did undergo a Marxist revolution in the beginning of the 20th century. But when this book, in this book here, The Indian Conquistadors, when this comes out in like 2006 or something like that, Mexican presses refuse to publish it because it challenges the idea that Native people are victims, and that's something that they're very comfortable with in Mexico. So in Spain, how is it received? Are the Spaniards paying attention? I don't think so. No. Spanish historians, I think, are interested in this stuff. Many of them, if they're like super passionate about it, they just move to Mexico. And I think there's not a real willingness to open up to anything beyond that traditional narrative that they, especially among like the general public in Spain. It's a good question.
Hey, Brad. Are there any contemporary Native scholars working in your field? What do they have to say about this event? What are their interpretations, or have they responded directly to your scholarship? I'm wondering if there's Native perspectives, contemporary ones that you can speak to.
Yeah, that's a good question. There are folks working in the field of early colonial history, Mexican history, Nahuatl speakers from Nahuatl communities today. And I think that they have largely been okay with this type of work. I haven't had any personal like responses from Native community members. But we have a lot of Native people interested in in how concepts from Europe get sort of filtered through Native languages and come to like have meaning in Native languages. And that's sort of a byproduct of conquest, right, and colonialism. So I don't think anybody is taking umbrage at this. Yeah. But that's, yeah, I should know more about that. But there are folks working in this field, sort of in like adjacent niches. Yeah.
I learned how to do this from Vanna White.
South Carolinian.
So what is, I'm thinking about Texcoco and you're talking about the, that people were acting in their self-interest. What's the social structures in the town that, like, part of them are going to help the Spanish, that, and then there's some that aren't, right?
Right.
So talk to me about, like, what's a social structure? Are there hierarchies that help
Yes.
explain that?
Yeah, so Nawa society is extremely hierarchical. It's like as hierarchical as Spanish society was in the 16th century. There's like very clear noble class and a very clear commoner class that is excluded from the nobility. There is no consensus decision making. This is a monarchy, and a military aristocracy. So they have the Texcocan ruling family has a lot of members, and again, like family dynamics are weird, right? And yeah, some of them, you know, rightly perceive that their power, that they are maintained in power by Montezuma, right? They're more closely related to him. He props them up, right? And then another faction of the family gets no support from Montezuma, and they resent the Aztec and Tenochtitlan, and it's in their interest to cut ties, right, and join the Spaniards. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but it also, but when you're talking about self-interest, whose self-interest, I guess?
Yeah, so I'm definitely talking about like the nobility, right? Yeah, and reviews of my book, they were all like, why don't you talk about the commoners? And I'm like, that would be great. But there aren't any sources for that. So, or at least none that I have found, really. I mean, it's the 16th century. It's Native people are only just beginning to learn how to use the Latin alphabet to write. And it takes a minute for them to start producing things that would be valuable for a study of like the very early. So it takes them a minute, and that makes study of the very early period like kind of tricky for commoners. But yeah, yes, this is a classist telling.
Thank you, Dr. Benton, for your presentation. So I'm sorry, I'm standing up. This is in my culture. So my question is, so in your book, you have already mentioned in the concluding part that you haven't found enough sources on ordinary people. That's why you couldn't work on them. So I think you made it very clear there. So my question is, you said that all native peoples are humans too, right? So you have also talked about family drama. So we know that in family drama, lots of internal politics go on. So what about the position of women? What have you found out about women, and how were they subservient, were they dominating, or were they also became parts of the patriarchal process? And my another question is, what about the position, or what are the relationships between Native women and Spanish women? Did you find any sources on that? Thank you.
Well, so our current understanding is that Nawa society is pretty patriarchal too. And so women in Nawa society, they occupy, I mean, like, not exactly the same role as they do in Europe, but it's like generally parallel, right, to what you would find in Europe. Like in Tenochtitlan, women have been excluded from rulership for, I mean, a couple hundred years, maybe just 100 years. In other parts of Mesoamerica, you do find women in charge of communities, and but that just wasn't the case in the 15th century, right before the Spaniards arrived for the capital of the Aztec Empire. Spanish women, like, there just aren't that many that come to Mexico. And so, yeah, I mean, we do have descriptions of what like life is like among people like right at the viceregal court in Mexico City, or yeah, we don't know a ton about Spanish society in 16th century Mexico. We know at this point, we know a lot more about Native society than we do Spanish society.
Hi, Brad.
Hi.
Going back to the everyday normal, non-noble folks, do you know of any archaeology that's been done in Texcoco or this part of the world?
That's a good question.
This time period, I should say.
There are, yeah, I don't know the archaeological scene, and I know it's shameful. It's shameful. That's a good question. There's like a summer palace that's been excavated there, but that does not really. Yeah, exactly. It does not get at commoners. So today, Texcoco is like tragic. It's like at the airport in Mexico City. It's a shadow of its former glory. And so I don't know if it's like top priority also, you know, for the National Institute of Archaeology. It's a good, because they're pyramids, you know, very close by, that are more shiny. Yeah.
Oh, excuse me, we have somebody waiting here.
Hi, Brad.
Hi.
Can you elaborate on the timeline between the Spanish arriving in Mexico and then Don Carlos's death by the Inquisition?
It was 18 years. 18 years later.
They converted in 18 years, and then
Yeah,
got
he would have been like
Inquisition.
sort of small, like a small child when the Spaniards arrived. And he's probably, I can't remember exactly how old he is, but he's not that old. He's 20s or 30s, right? And yeah, so 18 years. He has been converted as a child and decided as a young adult that that's no longer for him. Does that make sense? I did not bribe her with extra credit to come.
So you mentioned that Texcoco nowadays is basically underneath the airport and that its glory days are long behind it. I wonder if you have any narrative or information to share, because you know, like the nobility of Texcoco apparently allied with the Spanish to better their own position relative to Tenochtitlan. And to what extent did that, at least in the short term, pay off or not pay off to get us where we are now?
That's a very good question. And it's kind of hard to know if it worked or not, because if it worked, oftentimes those folks for whom it worked would leave Texcoco. They would move to Mexico City, right? But if it worked really well, might move to Spain, right? I mean, like the Montezuma family, they eventually get a ducal title, and they live in Spain now. The Texcocans did not do that well, but I do know some of them do move to Mexico City, and they have, you know, like townhouses in the capital, and I think that they live like pretty comfortably. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Well, the problem is trying to trace it, right? So it's not, you don't always have documents like for one person that stretch over much time, right? So I have one document of this one woman who lives in Mexico City in, 1620, and I think that she is the daughter or the granddaughter of somebody who used to live in Texcoco, like I think. And so, like early colonial history is sort of conjecture, informed guesses.
Dr. Benton, I have 5 questions from Zoom to ask you.
Is one of them from my mom?
I have an anonymous attendee, so potentially, yes.
Maybe that's her.
So I'm going to start with one from Mark Harvey. What do scholars know about how natives interpreted the effects of European introduced diseases into Mexico? If they understood that the Spanish indeed brought smallpox, etc., wouldn't this have complicated their decision to ally with Spaniards?
Yeah. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining. So the native understanding of disease in the period was complicated. Native people, the Nahuas, had their own understandings of how health and illness worked. And I actually just reviewed a book about this. And a lot of the natives' reaction to disease, they weren't talking about, smallpox or microbes or anything. They were talking about susto or fright illness, and they interpreted the disease epidemics as like the result of the impurity that Spaniards had brought to their territory that caused them alarm or fright, that and fright is like a kind of illness that exists in Mexico today. If you don't deal with the fright, bad stuff's going to happen. And so I think a lot of their interpretation was that they had not done enough of the cleansing rituals, like sweeping, that they needed to have done to sort of purge the city of the filth that the Spaniards had brought with them. Does that make sense? You didn't ask the question. I get it. But anyway, that's about all I know. Yeah, they interpreted it through their own worldview. And I mean, Spaniards also didn't understand disease either. So.
Okay, so the second Zoom question builds on an earlier inquiry about archaeology. This is from Shannon Eaker. She is asking, were artifacts taken from Mesoamerica to Spain for display, much like the English did with North African and Chinese artifacts?
For sure. Montezuma's headdress, or what is called Montezuma's headdress, is on display in Vienna, which is where Charles V was also based. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know much about that. Sorry, Shan.
I'm going to, noting the time, combine 2 of the remaining questions. So if you need me to reread at any, I believe you can do this. You can answer them both at once. Okay. So the first question asks, is this a trend of a more native accurate view of colonialism and that time period of the world historians are seeing across multiple cultures? And I'm going to connect it to a question from Joe Clays, which asks, has this view and information made its way into current teachings of the history in traditional school settings? It's very different and more accurate version of what I learned back then.
Yeah.
So is it part of a broader sort of understanding, and then has that made its way into schools, would be the combined version of the question.
I mean, I think historians generally are more sensitive to the histories of marginalized people. And I think that they have done a lot of work in the last, several decades of taking sources that we know well and trying to read between the lines a little bit, try to read against the grain to try to figure out if there is any other information there besides like the stated information. Like, can you like peek behind the curtain and see what's going on a little bit more clearly for marginalized groups. So, I mean, I think that that is true, yeah, broadly across multiple fields of history. And I think that that is starting to show up in secondary school textbooks, but I think that would depend on the state that you live in. And I don't really know. I don't interact with secondary school textbooks very much.
Well, you do for those listening online.
Last two pictures. It's not a very big history question here, but what's the thing in front of their faces?
Ooh, good question.
Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna go to this. So this is the same image right here, so here's Don Antonio. He is litigating actually. So he's litigating over this property, and this was submitted probably to some kind of court. This document, and he has his attorneys here with him, who are named. They're Spanish, but they have like indigenous, or this guy does anyway. He has an indigenous name glyph. So I don't know what his name was, but they're all speaking. These are speech scrolls. So they're like actively litigating. If you could see the whole thing, there's some judges up here sitting in judgment, and then the other party is over here on this side. But they're arguing about this land, this map. Yes, also that.
Yeah. Somebody's son just turned 4. Well, there are no more questions. Nice work out there.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah. I would like to introduce NDSU Provost, Dr. David Bertolini. This one or this one?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. The Phi Kappa Phi lecture is a great tradition of NDSU. It represents the best that NDSU offers, and each year the bar is raised to the highest level, so we thank Dr. Benton for keeping that tradition alive and raising it. I think for me, what makes it the best is it takes the superior excellence of our faculty in complex topics and brings it for us normal people to understand and to share. And that's certainly in the spirit of the land grant mission, that we educate everybody on these difficult things. So we're grateful for that. And so Dr. Benton, on benefit, President Cook sends his apologies for not being here today. He's in the middle of a legislative session, so he's doing everything he can to help us. So you get the next best, David, in that. But thanks to our friends online, Mark Harvey, hello. But I'll also just share a little bit too, is why historians are great, if I can do that in a couple of lines. But today's lecture was really touched me in a way, because about 100 years ago at the educational powerhouse of St. Petersburg Junior College, I saw a little poster. It wasn't any of the drawings you showed, but it was I think it was a later drawing of some Mayan ruins. And it said, "There's a trip happening." And I'm looking at it and I thought, God, that just looks so great. So I went to the historian that was offering it, and for the thing where it says, "Hey, we're going to go for a week," and I thought, and he kind of explained the things you did, but I was just kind of a dumb kid. I was just stunned. I was just like, God, that just sounds amazing to me as a culture and experience. And so I did it 2 years in a row. So I went to Tehuacan. I went to a tiny little place called Uxmal, which I think you know, and Chichen Itza, and it just blew me away. And then it's always been a part of my life. Everything, I'm just like a dumb novice, but I follow it as much as I can. And so to hear it today really brought full circle of why historians are great, because they help us get to the ultimate truth. And who would have thought, that it would have been part of my life for so long, but it is. So thank you so much on that. And so on behalf of NDSU, I think we have something to commemorate this event. Should have came the other way. So if you could come up here so we can let everybody on board, but to commemorate and give our deepest thanks for your expertise, and that we're so proud that you're here and part of our university. So thank you. And I think the thing that was that I'm really supposed to say is we're supposed to all go out here and there's cake and refreshments and we can ask Brad more about archaeology. So thank you.